Okay, let's begin. Good evening, Kalisperasas. Welcome everyone. I hope you're all well. Allow me to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to their elders past, present, emerging. Welcome to tonight's seminar, the annual Pontian Genocide Memorial Seminar. It's a joint event between the Greek community of Melbourne, PONTIAKI, ESTIA and Nuremberg, which is to be delivered by Dean Kalimniou. But before we proceed, can I have you all standing for a minute's silence in memory of the victims? You may now be seated. Thanks for that. Just before we move on, a few household items. Next week's seminar, Thursday the 29th of May, will be here at the mezzanine level. It'll be by Dr. Robert Nelson. He'll be speaking on should we reject Byzantium. Quite an interesting topic, so hope to see you all there. I'd also like to thank our sponsor for tonight's seminar, Romasiachos, in memory of Olga Siranidou. Thank you for the kind donation, and I invite you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice. There's still quite a few seminars without a sponsor for the rest of the year. Now let's return to tonight's topic. Between 1915 to 1923, the radical nationalist Young Turks of the Ottoman Empire sought to purge the Ottoman Empire of its Christian minorities. Scholars estimate that the death toll of the 20th century first genocide to have exceeded 2 million people. Although numerically mainly affected the Armenian populations residing within the Ottoman Empire, other Christian minorities were involved as well, particularly the Assyrians and the Greeks. Separate to this, there were hundreds of thousands of persons that were displaced during this period. However, the term genocide emerged in the mid-20th century, coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944 to describe the systematic destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And Lemkin's work was heavily influenced by the Holocaust and other instances of targeted persecution in the 20th century. Some claim that there's a causal effect between genocide committed by the Ottoman Empire and the Holocaust, as Nazi Germany was emboldened by the lack of repercussions on the Ottomans. Many like to quote Hitler's quote in a 1939 speech, who after all speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians. Later on, many Nazis that were involved were persecuted at the Nuremberg Trials. Something not widely known is that after World War I, a series of trials did take place to persecute Ottomans connected with genocide. In this lecture, our speaker takes us behind the personalities, the procedures, and the perpetrators in order to discover why over 100 years later, despite these trials, denialism, the crime of genocide, still exists, as well as how these court processes ultimately came to influence the Nuremberg Trials. And to take us across this journey, we have Dean Kalimniou, who has delivered this memorial seminar for over a decade now and never ceases to impress. I don't know what to say about Dean, as I've run out of superlatives. He's a lawyer, a columnist, a poet, short story writer, musician, an influencer, an activist. The list goes on. I always think of the modified adage, jack of all trades, but master of all. Όχι μόνο πολυτεχνίτης, αλλά πανταχού παρών και ακόμα και στο σπίτι. And I don't say this lightly, as when he commits to something, he puts his heart and soul behind it to guarantee a worthwhile outcome. And I've no doubt you'll see tonight's seminar where his passion, empathy and erudition will be on display and come to the surface. Big round of applause for our speaker tonight. Dean, welcome to the podium.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Ms. Skiakos, για τη χορηγία σου, remembering always Olga Sinanidou, a very brave woman who fought a fight isaxio of that of her ancestors against a very tough and deadly disease, and it's proper and right that we remember her today. So what I'm going to do, oops, this is unrelated to what I'm going to speak about tonight, but I thought that I'd leave this here, and that's because it's something that another friend of mine, Poulipi Apopse Panagiotis Iassonidis, would have commented on, and every year that I would give this lecture, the genocide lecture, he would call me the next day so we can discuss what I had spoken about, and he won't do this year because we lost him sadly last year. But he would have certainly had something to say about this. A couple of days ago, there was a special session of the Greek Parliament called to honour the memory of the genocide, and that's who turned up. There are more people in this room turned up here tonight to listen to me go on about various things than Greek politicians to honour the memory of those who perished in the genocide. And I think that's a very sobering thought. And when we complain sometimes that we don't get the συμμετοχή that we possibly could, that's an image which should perennially pop in our heads. And sometimes it's not enough to sprout the buzzwords. Sometimes you have to feel it, especially if you're going to stop this kind of thing, the genocide, from happening ever again. Yeah? Okay, enough of the virtue signalling. Who laughed? Okay, that's okay. So tonight we're talking about Judgment Day, and there's this belief that the Ottomans / Turks got off scot-free. There was a genocide, they were allowed to commit this genocide, and that's it, it's done, and they got away with it. And this lecture is about the fact that there were attempts made to bring the perpetrators to justice. And it's an interesting exercise because it's interesting to know what happened. That has implications for another set of trials that took place after another genocide / Holocaust, the Nuremberg Trials, and it could even have implications today with the various genocides going on around the world. So we know that after World War I, and that's the other thing, tonight is an almost Pontian-free zone in terms of the historical material. Why? Something we need to understand. The Pontian genocide has two phases. Up until 1919, you have Western Pondos being cleansed, but Eastern Pondos was untouched because Eastern Pondos was occupied by Russia, and it was relatively free for a few years towards the end of the war. It was only after the fall of Russia and the Lenin's deal with Kemal Atatürk that the second phase of the Pontian genocide took place. So what we're talking about here is a general genocide of Greeks in Asia Minor, which includes the western part of Pondos, not the east yet. That was perpetrated by Kemal's troops and irregulars after the events that we're discussing here. Okay, so let's keep that clear. Two phases to the Pontian aspect of the Greek genocide. And I like to use the word Greek genocide because it was something that affected all Greeks in Asia Minor, or mostly. The Pondos is a geographical indicator. It explains that people who lived in Pondos of Greek descent were subject to the genocide, but there was no targeted attempt by the Turks to specifically go after Greeks in Pondos. It was an overall broad thing, and I know we like to call it the Pontian genocide, we're used to it, but let's just keep that in mind. So after World War I, there's an effort to prosecute the Ottoman war criminals. Actually discussed in the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, Iriza Tukaku, included in the Treaty of Sèvres. That was the treaty which gave Greece the right to occupy Smyrna, and there was going to be a plebiscite to see whether that region would join on to Greece. Article 230 of that treaty requires the Ottoman Empire to hand over to the Allied powers the persons whose surrender may be required by the latter as being responsible for the massacres committed during the war. starting 1914 onwards. And we know that the Turkish government, these are the photos from the time, organised a series of courts-martial to prosecute war criminals. And we know, spoiler alert, they failed. And they failed because of internal political pressure, and we'll go through that. Taner Akçam, who's a very brave Turkish historian and a very inspirational human being, states that protecting war criminals from prosecution became a key priority of the Turkish nationalist movement. This is Kemal. We've got to remember what happened after the end of the First World War. The Ottoman government remained in place under the Sultan. Kemal goes away to Samsun'da in Pondos and lands there on the 19th of May 1919, which is why we commemorate the genocide on that day for Pondos, to create the Turkish nationalist movement in opposition to the Ottoman Empire. While everything that we're going to discuss tonight is going on, there are two separate governments in Turkey, okay? The Sultan in Constantinople, and I can say Constantinople because it was renamed Istanbul after this period, and Kemal in Pondos. So keep that in mind. Another reason why this thing may have failed, according to Giovanni Bonello, who's a famous international jurist, is because there was no appropriate legal framework with supranational jurisdiction, because there was no international framework to punish people for crimes of this nature. And we know that the word genocide was coined a lot later by Raphael Lemkin, and he did that inspired by what had happened to the Assyrians, which is all part of this story, but we're not going to talk about that tonight. So what happens is eventually these Turks who were going to be tried for this crime were released, and certain things happen that we'll talk about later. And a lot of these people, here's some of them, perpetrators, escaped and went to live in other countries. Some of them went to Central Asia, like Enver Pasha, one of the heads of the Turkish government, the Neo-Turks, who spearheaded and conceived the genocide. And then there was this Armenian group called Operation Nemesis, which was created, and their sole aim was, okay, you guys have escaped justice and you were not tried the way you were going to be tried, so we're going to come and find you and we are going to kill you. And they did that. In Berlin, they assassinated Talat Pasha, a few other people who were perpetrators of the genocide, because they felt that this process had not taken place and justice was denied. There was a famous court case in Berlin with Solomon Tehlirian, who was the killer of Talat Pasha in Berlin, and he was acquitted by the court in Berlin because the provocation was so great, which is an interesting precedent. But that's something else. Henry Morgenthau, Sr., if you haven't read his book on what was going on in First World War, please get it. It's a very important first-hand account of the plight of the Armenians and the Greeks during the war. He was there. He actually spoke to the members of the Turkish government who were committing the genocide, and he writes very candidly about what he was told. They trusted him, and it was before Turkey entered the war. So it's interesting. Read that. But because of his reports, this caused the Allies to formally warn the Ottoman Empire as far back as 1915. In view of these crimes of Turkey against humanity and civilization, first time this was coined as a doctrine, the Allied governments announced publicly that they will personally hold responsible all members of the Ottoman government and those of their agents who were implicated in such massacres. So the warning's there even before the war is over. If you don't stop doing this, when the war is over, there will be retribution. This was the first time this type of legal framework, or the conception of such legal framework, was, if you like, articulated. The whole idea was they were going to face criminal prosecution regardless of rank or authority, and this formed the legal principles behind the 1946 Nuremberg Trials that I alluded to earlier. It became enshrined in the international law, in the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Later on, there was previous international law. There was the Treaty of Hague I, the Treaty of Hague II, which made no provision of what criminalising the acts an army does against its own people. That did not exist in the legal framework. In actual fact, the old Hague Conventions, to which Turkey was a signatory as at the Ottoman Empire, provided for the legality of a right of reprisal. if you rebel, if you don't do what you're told, we're within our rights to put you down violently. And that was upheld generally by all of the world powers, because at that time they were colonial powers. And they were all guilty of doing these things in their colonial empires. So it suited their purpose at that time. So the events of World War I and what the Ottomans did during the war brought to light new and interesting discussions in international law at the Paris Peace Conference about a state's duty to protect its own citizens and also to protect other states' citizens. In this situation, protecting your own citizens, because these were all Ottoman citizens that were victims. Yeah. Now, the Ottoman Empire was party to the 1856 Treaty of Paris, which attached the state to the Concert of Europe and international law and the Hague Convention. So they didn't exist in a vacuum. They were party to these treaties. But over the course of World War I, the Committee of Union and Progress, which was the Neo-Turk movement, which was ruling Turkey at the time, pulled out of all of these treaties to give them a free hand to commit the genocide. And the explanation that they gave was that these treaties have been imposed by the colonial powers in order to dominate Turkey. So we're going to pull out of them as a nationalistic act of reobtaining our sovereignty. So that's how they justified it. Moving to November 1918, the war is over. There's the Armistice of Mudros, ceasefire. There's a debate in the Ottoman Chamber of Deputies. For the first time ever, Greek deputies feel free to speak their mind and say what they believe. One of them is, well, that's a picture of the genocide and what happened. We'll go from there, in case you weren't sure about that. This gentleman here, Emanuel Emanuelidis, a very brave man, accuses the president of the Ottoman Chamber, Halil Mendershe, for enriching himself during the genocide, seizing the victims' properties and lands. And he calls for new elections, he calls for Halil to step down, and these proposals were rejected. And during the session, he puts forward an 8-point proposal calling for the punishment of Talat Pasha and his friends. They were the ruling triumvirate, saying that the Committee of Union and Progress persecuted Armenians and Greeks. And the motion is as follows. 1 million people, including women and children, people who had committed no crimes other than being Armenian, were cut down and killed. 250,000 members of the Greek community, this is the statistics he had at hand in 1918, which has for at least, this is his words, the last 40 centuries been the true agent of civilization in this country, were expelled from the Ottoman Empire. Some 550,000 more Greeks were murdered at sea and on land, and their property was seized. Since non-Muslim communities within the empire were barred from conducting trade and commerce was left to the thievery of the authorities, the whole nation has been cheated. So the idea that by attacking the minorities, the whole nation becomes a victim, which is an interesting thought. Various Ottoman deputies who should have had parliamentary immunity, like Zohrab Effendi and Vartkes Effendi, they were Armenians, were assassinated. Some 250,000 people serving in the labour battalions, Amele Tamburu, they would just grab the Greeks and set them into labour battalions in the Far East, where it was very cold, without clothes, without food, without shoes, working them to death until they died, which was something that the Nazis were inspired by later on, and we have evidence of this. There's a very influential book by a guy called Stefan Zechrig who's written about this and explains just how the Nazis studied the Ottoman techniques and in order to replicate them when it came time to persecute the Jews. And we know that the Ottomans, in doing this in an organised fashion, were helped by German officers, career officers who were hired by the Ottomans to do so. So it's like a cycle. And interestingly enough, so that's Sfayes, that's in Fokea near Smyrni, more of them. Now these two articles here are basically reiterating the same points that I've just made. That was the speech of Emanuelidis in the Ottoman Parliament, except this is a letter by one of the co-founders of the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria, and he was also the proxenos, the consul of Greece here in Melbourne in 1919, Alexandros Maniakis, and he wrote a letter to the Age newspaper. That one I think is for the Age, yes, and that one is the Argus, on the 5th and on the 11th of February 1919, informing people here in Melbourne about that speech and all of those points. They're the two articles there. And for me, that's amazing. First of all, we have the Greek community, this very centre here, at the forefront of informing people here and trying to influence public opinion and agitating for some type of understanding. At a time when no internet, no television, and yet this guy was very switched on and knew exactly what he was talking about. And I'd like to thank Mr. Kostas Markos for making me aware of these articles and providing them for me tonight, because I think the Australian connection and the connection to this community is very important. This lovely looking gentleman, Ali Fethi Okyar, told Emanuelidis, no, if you suffered, so did we as Turks, and we were also victims, okay? We were perhaps more abused and mistreated by anyone, he says in the parliamentary debates, and all the Turks in the chamber, according to reports, yelled out bravo or something equivalent. Emanuelidis responds saying that those responsible for the genocide were not individuals but an entire political movement. So just like scholars are trying to say that the Nazi movement itself was responsible, for example, for the Holocaust, and not just individuals, Emanuelidis is trying to create a collective sense of blame against the CUP. And he may have been right. There were ideologues within that movement that talked about how all those non-Turkish nations had to be removed. Other Greek and Armenian deputies raised questions about the scope and abuses of the temporary law of deportation. Turkish deputies said, no, the casualty figures are exaggerated. And this gentleman here, Mehmet Emin Bey of Trapezunda, said it is not right to wipe out one injustice with another. Yes, I say that our government slaughtered a great number of women and children, and their property was looted. But the number is not 1 million, it was about 500 to 600,000. So that's okay then. And furthermore, it is not right to say that these people were killed because of their ethnicity. Okay. There's an Armenian deputy, Arten Boshgezinian, who says, well, why were the Armenians killed? And he replies, because they were rebellious. In other words, Galana Pathun. And that the army had also killed many Turks as well. Why they did that, we don't know. And the session ended with the government minister saying, may Allah curse the oppressors, to which they all said, Amin, Amin, or words to that effect. And then they said, okay, we're going to have a commission. We'll organise, what does the government do when they want to obfuscate, whether it's here, whether it's there? Let's set up a commission to investigate, yeah? How all this happened. And there were other sessions in the Ottoman Parliament, and there would be heated discussions between Greek, Turkish, Armenian MPs about war crimes. For example, the Lake One massacre of the Armenians. An inquiry was brought up about this war criminal here, General Liman von Sanders, who ordered the deportation of the Greeks from Ayvali and the western coast of Asia Minor. And many people died during that, and they pushed for him to be tried. They talked about collective responsibility belonging to the whole of the CUP movement. Then there was a guy called Georgi Ioannidis, who was a Pontian MP, and I can't find a photo of him, so sorry, I looked for one, who brings up a hypothetical. So, okay, guys, I hear both sides. You're saying that we rebelled, Kalana Pathum, we deserved it. Let's suppose that Nicola does something bad. Does this give someone the right to drive 500 or 600 Christians into the mountains, loot their property and slaughter them? This was not just a deportation, it was annihilation. So this is within the Ottoman Parliament, victims giving it to the perpetrators. And that has not happened before, and that has not happened since. It is a really interesting time where, because the Allies are occupying Constantinople, these subject peoples suddenly feel empowered enough to speak up. Okay, very important. And then eventually you have this guy, Mehmet Faik Bey of Edirne, which is Adrianoupoli now, saying, we learned to do these deportations from our neighbours. We didn't invent them. And what he's referring to is the fact that during the Balkan Wars, many Muslims who were in the conquered regions that came under control of Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, were forcibly thrown out of their homes and had to go back to Turkey, and that there were many massacres and a lot of nasty things taking place. And that, by the way, is true. Okay? And also the genocide of the Circassians by the Russians, which is another topic that we should look at one day. Then you have Ilya Sami Efendi saying, look, why were non-Muslims protected and favoured? And they actually had it better than we did because they were protected by the world powers. And, you know, even though 80%, he says, even though 80% of Armenians were innocent, they have themselves to blame for what happened to them because they rebelled. Okay? I've put this here, and I'm going to refer to it later, but I put it here because we're going to hear about one guy who decided that a good thing to do was to plonk everyone onto these rafts in Trapezuda, the Armenian population, set them out into the sea, and they can drown. And ladies and gentlemen, the Greeks knew all about this and did nothing to help these people, because that's the other thing about divide and rule. Today it happens to them. Okay, we better not do anything to help them in case it should happen to us. But if you don't do anything to help them, it does happen to you, and it did happen to us. Yeah, it's that thing that I think it was Bornhofer. First they came for the whoever, and I did nothing, then they came for them, and then they came for me, and there was no one to help me. That kind of thing. That's the moral of the story here. No one is above moral cowardice, okay? So there's that. Okay, so what happens? That's the Sultan, and under the Sultan's, no, actually that's not, that's Tevfik Pasha, who was the Prime Minister under the Sultan. He starts arresting all these members of the CUP. So how there was a denazification program with the occupying powers after the Second World War, how, for example, the Americans tried to de-Ba'athicize Iraq after the fall of Saddam. We're trying to de-CUP the Ottoman Empire at the moment, and it's great because all of a sudden they're looking to turn over a new leaf, new broom. No. All this was about, and they said it themselves, is that the Allies linked the partition of the empire with these war trials. We are going to partition the empire, and we are going to have these war trials. Something that made them not very happy, so the motivation behind complying with the Allied directive is this. Perhaps if we show cooperation with this, they won't partition our empire. And that's all it was. Okay. And there's arguments, and Damat Ferid Pasha, who was the Sultan's son-in-law, rejects calls for collective responsibility. You can't blame the entire regime. You can only blame certain people, because the innocent Turkish nation is free of the stain of injustice. And that reminds us, ladies and gentlemen, of a similar debate after the Second World War. Was the entire German nation responsible for the Holocaust? Did they know, or should they ought to have known? To what extent do we ascribe collective responsibility? These are important questions, and we see their commencement here. Okay. So Damat Ferid Pasha says the whole blame rests squarely on a few leaders of the CUP, Committee of Union and Progress, who through their alliance with Germany, always blame the Germans, I know I do, and their control of the army, had terrorised the rest of Turkey into a submission. So again, everybody's a victim. It's not just these people who died. Turkey is a victim as well. Okay. Not only had the Christians been persecuted, but 3 million Muslims felt the terror of the CUP as well. It's an argument. It's an argument that many Germans gave when questioned about their moral responsibility. So that was something that was in common between the nationalists who hated the Sultan's government and the Sultan's people as well. They agreed on this. There's no such thing as collective responsibility. You go after individuals. So Damat Ferid Pasha said, okay, we'll go after Talat, Enver, Jamal. They were the 3 people who ruled Turkey. They were the 3 leaders of the triumvirate that ruled Turkey during the war. And a couple of secondary accomplices, some of their evil henchmen lurking with big mustaches in the background. This is really easy because they had fled. Talat was in Berlin having cake, Jamal was in Berlin having cake, and Enver was off in Central Asia trying to liberate Turkestan from the Bolsheviks, and he eventually died there. He was killed during clashes with the Bolsheviks. So yeah, the whole idea is it wasn't our fault collectively. We didn't deserve this. A few people overplayed their hand, and therefore the empire should not be partitioned, which was what the Allies originally wanted. According to Taner Akçam, the partition of the empire as a punishment for war crimes was, if you like, the primary justification, and Ferid Pasha's rebuke of the partition, his insistence that the Ottoman Empire should remain as it is something that the Allied powers at this stage, who are sitting pretty, they just laughed. They said, no, we're going to partition your empire and we are going to have these war trials. So this is already, before all this begins, you can see what the Turkish response is. I can't remember who he is and I don't know what he's doing there. But he looks very serious, and so would I be as well. It's actually Ferid Pasha when he's older, that's right, okay. They're the three perpetrators. The one in the middle is Enver, that's Jamal, and that boy there's Talat. And they are responsible for the death of millions. Yeah, that's them. So they were condemned to death in absentia, spoiler alert, but they were not, they had escaped. So they got out of that. Lloyd George referred to Ottoman representations to not partition the empire, not link them to the war crimes as good jokes, quote, good jokes. And on the 25th of June 1919, the Council of Ten, which was the Allied Commission that was set up to investigate all this, says the Turks as a people cannot evade responsibility for murdering these people without justification. That's what they say. And therefore culpability befell on the whole Turkish people. And a nation, they say, must be judged by the government which rules it. These are interesting broad legal principles. Didn't play out that way, but that has implications for the Nazis, for things that are going on in Rwanda, for things that are going on now, all of that. So yeah, delegates of the Big Five in 1919 create the Commission on the Responsibility of the Authors of War and Enforcement of Penalties, known as the Commission of 15, and that's the act which founds that body to set up a framework to, if you like, allow for the prosecution of war crimes. And this commission concludes that World War I was started by Germany, no excrement, Sherlock, in a premeditated fashion, and that the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, who were their allies, were responsible, they were accomplices for assisting Turkey's quest to wage a war. So that's the primary thing. How do we establish Germany's war guilt so we can get the reparations? Their accomplices must also be guilty. And the report accuses all the Central Powers, so the three countries listed, of conducting the war in a barbaric or illegitimate manner that violates established laws, traditions of war, and the principles of humanity. This is interesting because what they're saying is that the Ottoman Empire not only conducted war against the Allies, but also against its own people, its own citizens. That's an interesting concept that has never, ever been articulated in this way before, and it is now. So then they're arguing over the framework. How are we going to set this up? What kind of legal principles are we going to use to try these leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress? And they decide to try them on the basis of humanitarian principles of the Hague Conventions. Any person at the Hague Convention provides accused of crimes against humanity or against any laws and customs of war shall be criminally prosecuted, regardless of their rank, including heads of state. And less unanimous among the Commission was where and how these trials are going to be conducted. Should we do them in Paris and we're close to the Brassiere and the Bistro and whatever? Should we do them in Constantinople, which is close to where the criminals are, alleged? We don't know. And then they decided, you know what? We'll probably go and do that in Constantinople. And then on the 9th of April, Woodrow Wilson, who was a great, not only was President of America, but was a great lecturer in political science and history and philosophy, dropped previous objections to what those in his government derided as a law of humanity. I mean, there was pressure in America, there was kickback. They were saying, no, there's no such thing as a law of humanity. This kind of thing was in its infancy, and they decided, no, what we're going to do is we're not going to have human rights tribunals, because that's a bit way out there. and dangerously Bolshevik and communistic, and we can't have that. We're going to have court-martials. You did not operate the way soldiers should have. Okay, that's what they decided to do. So on the 12th of November in 1918, the Allied forces disembark in Constantinople. That's a news report talking about how these three people are the perpetrators of the genocide. It's an Ottoman newspaper. Yeah. So the Allies, and that's the French contingent, disembark in Constantinople to enforce a military presence in the city. How are you going to round up these people if you're not actually occupying the city, just like they did in Baghdad without the green zone? And they go around trying to round up these war criminals, the ones that they've identified as being as such, and asking the Ottoman authorities, well, can you find some for us as well? Because we don't know who all of them are, but perhaps you do. So whoever you can round up, hand them over. And Sultan Mehmed, who's still in power, is a bit worried about this. He supports the effort, but he says, look, this is going to get me killed. If I don't look like I'm supporting my own people, I'm going to get assassinated. So let's do this, but me metro, and in a way that doesn't result in me getting killed. And but there was some type of grassroots support for this cleansing by the reconstructed Freedom and Accord Party, which was the liberal section of the CUP. So the CUP was conceived in the beginning in 1908 when the new Neo-Turk movement took place. It was going to be a broad coalition of forces, including minorities. And in the beginning, it allowed for minorities to have equal rights and an equal status with Turkish or Ottoman identified people. And it was actually celebrated by the minorities. You see posters and lithographs, I don't have one, but you can find them, of the various nationalities of the Ottoman Empire celebrating the coup of the Neo-Turks, because finally there's democracy and equality. It gradually transpired that that was not the agenda. That was just a way to drag everyone in and get support, which was kind of how the mullahs came into power in Iran. Originally it was a coalition between the communists, the socialists and the mullahs, and to bring democracy, and then they just eased them out and then started killing them, yeah? CUP did the same thing. Freedom and Accord Party is the liberal with a small L, not the buggered up coalition ones that we have here, who actually were into these silly principles like democracy and freedom of thought and all that rubbish that we don't do anymore because it's a superseded discourse. And they publicly asked the Sultan, can you please support this effort? Big mistake. A lot of these people who asked for that didn't have a good end. So those that were already in British custody didn't have their legal regimes decided, what are we going to do with them? How's it going to work? What happens is that the British War Ministry authorises the military tribunal. They decide to have a tribunal. That's one of the jurists. That's what we're looking at, some of the crimes, some of the evidence that was provided. And this gentleman here, who is Sir Somerset Gough Calthorpe, goes and protests to the Ipsili Pili, the Sublime Porte, and says, you know what, if you don't give us the proper people who need to be tried, we're going to take this out of your hands, we're going to do it yourself, because they weren't giving them the people that they needed. Yeah, and then you have this guy here who, Robert De Niro? Seriously, I can't believe it. Guess who's back in the circle of trust, everybody? Not the Ottomans. But that's Admiral John de Robeck, and he takes control of the proceedings, and he says, you know what, this is a farce. They're going through the motions. They're not investigating. There's these stupid little trials where they're asking them really puerile questions. No one's getting convicted. We need to take control of this because quite likely the British found the continental inquisitorial system of penal procedure used in Turkey repugnant to its own paths of criminal justice. So there's a court process, it's a really crappy one. Did you commit a crime? Maybe, I don't know. No, I didn't. Okay, that's the kind of thing we're talking about, yeah? Robert De Niro, goodbye. Don't know why he's there. Okay, we're going to go into testimonies now because I've gone on for too long. I've just realised that I've been talking for ages. Vehib Pasha, it's one of my heroes, condemned the genocide. He was from Yanina. He was the brother of Esat Pasha, the last Pasha of Yanina, who the people from Yanina loved. He was so beloved that after the city was reconquered by the Greeks, they allowed him to stay there for 6 months for the sake of stability and because they trusted him until new arrangements were made. Vahib was a Greek speaker, studied in Yanina, a Grecophile, and he says this: the massacre and destruction of the Armenians and the Greeks and the plunder and pillage of their goods were the result of decisions reached by the Young Turks Central Committees. The atrocities were carried out under a program that was determined upon and involved a definite case of premeditation. It was also ascertained that the atrocities and crimes were encouraged by the district attorneys, whose dereliction of judicial duties in face of the occurrence, and especially their remaining indifference, renders them accessories to these crimes. And he mentions Dr. Behayeddin Shakir, who's this gentleman here, who was the ideologue. He was the Goebbels of the CUP, who was advocating the destruction of the Greeks and the Armenians and the other Christians in the empire. So Vahib Pasha gives this testimony during the trials, and then after the Kemalist government takes over, he has to flee. His life is not safe, and he dies in exile. I think he died in Italy, I can't remember. Then we have Fayez el-Hussein from Jordan. So he was Arab, and he witnessed the massacres, and he spoke of the fact that what took place was in opposition to Islamic principles. He says, is it right that these impostors who pretend to be supporters of Islam and the Khilafat, the Caliphate, the protectors of Muslims, should transgress the command of God, the traditions of the Prophet and humanity? Truly they have committed an act at which Islam is revolted, as well as all Muslims and the people of earth. As God lives, it is a shameful deed. As to their preparations, the flags, the bombs and the like, even assuming there to be some truth in the statement, that's that the Christians were rebellious and got what was coming to them, it does not justify the annihilation of the whole people, men and women, old men, children, in a way which revolts humanity, and more especially Islam and the whole body of Muslims. So he took that view. He was, because of his religious principles, he found this to be an atrocious deed, which he said was carried out with every circumstance of brutality. So that's his testimony. Then you have Reshif Akif Pasha, also of Albanian descent, who provided important testimony on the genocide. And he said that as in his short tenure as president of the Council of State, he uncovered documents relating to the deportations of the Christians. The documents displayed the process in which official statements made use of vague terminology in order to cover up the deportation, only to be clarified by special orders ordering massacres sent directly from the Community of Unity and Progress, headquarters often from Talat Pasha himself. And Talat Pasha admitted to Henry Morgenthau, the American ambassador, that this is what he did. Okay, and he said that this is as follows: I came cognizant of some secrets. I came across something strange. It was the official order of deportation issued by the notorious Interior Ministry and relayed to the provinces, okay, urging the expedition of the execution of all the accursed mission. Therefore, the brigands, that's the soldiers, proceeded to act, and the atrocious massacres were the result. So he says that. That's his testimony. He was there. I am ashamed, he goes on, as a Muslim. I am ashamed as an Ottoman statesman. What a stain on the reputation of the Ottoman Empire, these criminal people. Then we have Ahmet Reza, who in 1915 was one of the only Ottoman politicians who actually had the guts during the war to get up and condemn the genocide. There was a law to confiscate all property. He said, it is not legal to classify the goods mentioned by the law as abandoned goods because the owners of these goods did not abandon them willingly. They were exiled, expelled forcefully. And then he says this is contrary to the Ottoman constitution and adds, strong arm me, expel me from my village, sell my property, this is never lawful. No Ottoman conscience or law can ever accept this. Another testimony, there's a few more, but I think they're instructive. Mehmet Jalal Bey, who saved thousands of lives. He's known as the Oscar Schindler of the Ottoman Empire. And he was in Aleppo. And originally, when he saw the orders to annihilate the Christians, he said, no, that can't be right. I don't believe it, so I didn't follow the orders. I refused to do so. But then he began to realize that these were serious orders and that there would be repercussions if he did not comply. So he kept on sending letters back to Constantinople saying, no, this is no good. I can't do this. So what was he done? He was transferred to Konya, Ikonio, in Cappadocia, because he would not listen. And he would send letters saying the measures taken against these people are contrary to the higher interests of the fatherland, and he was dismissed and not spoken of. So he went to Constantinople. He went and sought his superiors, who said, don't worry, it's not going to happen. I don't know what you're worrying about. We're not those kind of people. We don't do those kind of stuff. And then by the time he got to Konya, the CUP had told his underlings to carry out the massacres and the deportations, and there was no one left. Okay. But he managed to save about 10,000 people who he hid. And he compared himself to a person sitting by the side of a river, which absolutely no means of saving anyone. Blood was flowing in the river, and thousands of innocent children, irreproachable old people, were streaming down to the river towards oblivion. Anyone I could save with my bare hands I could. The others streamed down the river, never to return. That's the Tigris, the Euphrates. I think that's the Euphrates that goes through Aleppo. So there's that. Then there's this lovely gentleman here, Mehmed Rashid from Diyarbakir in eastern Turkey, who gave this testimony. He was quite proud of it. Being a doctor could not cause me to forget my nationality. Rashid is a doctor. He likes to refer to himself in the third person like Julius Caesar, but he was born a Turk. Either the Armenians and the Greeks were to eliminate the Turks, or the Turks would eliminate the Armenians and the Greeks. I did not hesitate when I was confronted with this dilemma. I can answer as follows. The Armenians and the Greeks had become hazardous microbes in the body of this country. Well, isn't it a doctor's duty to kill microbes? Okay, so that's one of the steps towards genocide, which is dehumanizing the victim. They're no longer people, they're microbes. Okay, makes it very easy then to do nasty things to them. But the reason why I gave these testimonies, ladies and gentlemen, of these righteous Turkish people who stood up and said the truth is because sometimes in the bitterness, victims and descendants of victims have this, do the opposite. They dehumanize the Ottomans, and they say, well, look, there's something about these people and their DNA or their culture that causes them to be that way. And I'm here to say that's not the case. Look at these people. Look how they stood up. It's very easy to get a bunch of people to see another people as an enemy and to get them to start slaughtering each other. What did we do to each other in the Civil War? Yeah? Very easy. What we need to do as a civil society is to protect against extremism and things like that happening by respecting everybody and treating them as equals. Again, virtual signalling bracket over. Hafiz Mehmet was the deputy governor of Trapezunda, and he testified in the Chamber of Deputies. Under the pretext of sending off to Samsunda, the district's governor loaded the Armenians into the barges, that's what we saw before, the picture, and had them thrown overboard. I heard that the Governor General applied this procedure throughout the province, so throughout Pondos. Even though I reported this in the Interior Ministry, immediately upon my return to Constantinople, I was not able to initiate any action. I tried for 3 years to get some action instituted in vain. He tried for 3 years to stop the genocide from happening. Yeah? And Jamal Azmi, who was the guy that did this, was sentenced to death under charges of forced murder and forced relocation, but he was saved. So anyway, we got to the point where the Robert De Niro is really upset with the way that these trials are happening, and the Allied government decides to relocate the Turkish prisoners who had been arrested and implicated for crimes of war and genocide, and take them to Malta, where it was a British colony. They felt that they could take control of proceedings and run them the way they wanted. And they went with their families, and they're kind of looking comfortable and relaxed, aren't they? Yeah, it's kind of good. So they were secluded in 3 different groups. A, people suspected of having taken part in the massacres. They only got stools, not deck chairs. B, people suspected of having tolerated the massacres. They got deck chairs but no sunscreen. And C, people who were not suspected of having taken direct action in the massacres, and they had no Wi-Fi. So at this time, the competing Ankara government of Kemal Atatürk is in ascendancy. There he is there, proclaiming his state. And they said, you know what, this is garbage, this is colonialism, this is imperialism, you shouldn't be doing this is an infringement upon Turkish sovereignty. This is yet another example of why there should be no sultan, because the sultan and his discredited government, which is toadying to the Allies, is actually giving away Turkey's sovereignty and not acting in its best interests. So we're not happy with this. And you know what? If you don't give us our soldiers back, we are going to start seriously thinking about executing all of the British prisoners in our, in our custody. And that caused the British to think a bit, and there was a bit of a discussion about this, and they were not happy. And Somerset Gough Calthorpe said, well, we can't have this. This is not cricket. Destroying British prisoners or threatening to do so. And then they're having a bit of a discussion about it here. This is the inaugural meeting of the Panamian Society. That just slipped in there. There they are having a bit of a chat. And then Lord Curzon turns up. Lord Curzon was the Viceroy of India. He was also the author of the Curzon Line. He partitioned Poland after the First World War. And he has a bit of a think about this because he's in a position of authority, head of the Colonial Office, Foreign Minister, all of that, and says, you know what, not happy about this, but at the end of the day, 22 British prisoners are worth a very large amount of Turks. So we're going to exchange them. So what happened, ladies and gentlemen, in the end of all of this is that the Turkish or Ottoman prisoners of war who were detained on Malta to be tried for crimes of, or not genocide at the time, but for committing the genocide, were handed back to Turkey, and they got their British soldiers in return. And that was that. And it kind of reminds you of the time when Max Merton came to Greece. He was that Nazi war criminal in Greece that ordered massacres and all sorts of brutalities against the Greek population in the Second World War. He fled at the end, went to Germany, came back as some type of dignitary of the West German government, was arrested in Greece. They recognised him, came for a holiday in the 50s. And Germany said, you know what, if you try this guy for crimes committed while he was in Greece, we're going to send all of your Gastarbeiter back home, and we're going to stop them from sending you money back home, and that'll be that. And the Kalimniou government caved and let him go, because that's how these things work. Sometimes expediency is more important than justice, and that's what could have been. They were setting up the War Crimes Tribunal in Malta. Didn't work. Giovanni Bonello is talking about how the suspension of the prosecutions, the repatriation, the release of the Turkish detainees was as a result of the fact that there was no appropriate legal framework to try these people, and it facilitated the British doing a deal because there was no legislation which told them what to do. They were making it up as they had to go along, and that's difficult when you don't know what you're doing, and he won. You know, and we remember that there was that face-off in the Dardanelles where he made a move on the Dardanelles later on and said, you know what, British, occupying the place, our soldiers are going to start firing on yours, and you're going to get the hell out of here. And the British caved. And there was no justice for the victims. Yeah? And Robert De Niro, Sir John Michael de Robeck, who was the second in command during the Dardanelles push when Atatürk came and set out, said, you know what, it kind of would have been hard under these conditions to convict these exiles before an Allied court. Probably wouldn't have worked anyway. You know, next time we'll figure it out. But it's just sad that you little guys who think you're European copped what you copped. And yeah, better luck next time. So, can't remember who he is. We'll figure out who he is. So there were a couple of domestic prosecutions nonetheless of CUP people who perpetrated the genocide, but that's because some of these people fell foul of Kemal Atatürk. And some of those people like Topal Osman, there's a statue of Topal Osman in his homeland in Pondos, even though he was a genocidal freak who not only committed massacres against Pontic Greeks, but also did it in very brutal fashion. He was very sadistic, and he did this at the behest of Kemal Atatürk, but also enjoyed doing it and had a lot of autonomy in doing it, to the extent where, having committed all these brutalities, he topira panotos, we say in Greek, and then he started lording it over everyone else, and Kemal thought he's a threat, he has to go, and he actually used his brutality against Greeks and Armenians during that time as an excuse for him to be punished. So when it suited them, certain people within the Turkish government used these crimes in order to remove people who were annoying to them, yeah? And so when that happens, you say, okay, what's going on? 1926, for example, Kemal had 6 genocide perpetrators, including Nazim Bey, who's this guy, there, and Yenibakhcheli Nail Bey hanged for allegedly plotting to assassinate him, but he did throw in the fact that they were rather brutal, rather nasty, and deserved what they got. So, Judgment Day? No. Judgment was averted. Judgment was averted, why? Because there was no legal framework. They didn't think it through. They did not have the time nor the inclination to come up with a legal framework under which these people could be tried. B, they were more interested in partitioning the empire and carving it up, and if it wasn't for Atatürk, they would have succeeded. That was more important than bringing these people to trial. Bringing the people to trial was intended to cow them into submission, to destroy the heads of these organisations who exercised power, which would allow them to rule their sectors of the Ottoman Empire partition a lot more easily. 100 years on, and a little bit more, we're in the state now where Turkey, where, as you can see, was freely admitting to these crimes, is now denying them. We're in a position where many countries around the world, and influential countries like France, like America, are recognising these genocides. And we're in a position where here in freedom-loving and democratic Australia, our Australian government does not, even though all this information exists. So, food for thought, ladies and gentlemen, about how political expediency works, how the world powers work, and also how the international law is sometimes just merely the law of the jungle if there isn't the political will to back it up. So thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for another incredible presentation. The floor is open to questions. Just raise your hand. Mr. Sahanidis.
Thanks, Dean. It was a great lecture. Given that there was no crime of genocide back then, how do you prosecute it now retrospectively? Is that possible to do that?
I don't think you can, and the reason why is because, as you say, it wasn't on the statute books, and they tried to get around that by issuing a court-martial for conduct unbecoming of officers, massacres of this nature being against basic rules of war. That's how they tried to do it. Although there was that discussion, as I said, about the fact that they talked about creating crimes of attacking your own people during war. All the perpetrators are dead. And the brilliant thing, well, not brilliant thing, but the difficulty here is that here you have Turkey, which is Kemalist Turkey, which comes after these events, not after the second part of the Pontian genocide, but after these events with the war trials, who says, well, that's got nothing to do with us, we're a reinvented government. And the way you'd get around that and say, yes, but you've assumed sovereignty over the same country, so you are liable. But the question is, 100 years later, who would want to do that? Turkey is a very important strategic power. It's a power that is courted by almost everyone in the region. And whose interests would it serve to do something like this? It would only serve the interests of people who wanted, for some reason, to dominate Turkey, which is what the Turkish state was founded on. It was founded on by Kemal Atatürk upon the guiding principle of we will never be dominated by anyone ever again. And so far they've succeeded in that. So unless there is the political will by international players with the strength to do so, to drag them to court, and even then the legal regime is a bit difficult because as we said at that time, this was not illegal and the term genocide had not even been invented. Don't see how that's going to happen. It's pretty hard. And then you have to go into the fact that, you know, the Treaty of Lausanne stops Greece from seeking retribution. Yeah? Just as it stops Turkey from seeking retribution against about the war crimes of the Greek army in Asia Minor. And of course we say war crimes is different to genocide. Yeah, one's not compared with the other. But did the Greek army commit war crimes in Asia Minor during the 1919-1922 war? Yes, they did. Treaty of Lausanne says, "Ό,τι έγινε, έγινε." That's the end of it now, okay? Unless we want to review the Treaty of Lausanne, which means we also have to review things like the islands that we ended up with and the stabilisation of the borders. Do we want to open up that can of worms? No. Every time Erdogan intimates the fact that the Treaty of Lausanne is not just and should be reviewed, we tremble in our boots. So we can't really go there. Armenians are a different story, but we have signed away our rights to do something about this.
Hi, sorry, just clarifying as well. Did Woodrow Wilson's 14-point plan or the League of Nations not address any aspect of this?
Not this aspect. That was more to do with the right for self-determination of nations. For example, Wilsonian Armenia, which was a massive part of eastern Turkey, which was going to be an Armenian state, and ultimately that was not ratified by Congress. So America did not endorse that and was not part of that.
Recently, my sister and I went to see our grandfather's village, Levisi, in Turkey, modern-day Turkey.
Wow, Levisi, you're from there originally.
That's right.
Amazing.
And village was deserted since the Greeks left.
And they won't go and live there because they think there's ghosts.
Yeah. But for me, it was a very emotional experience walking down the deserted streets when it used to be a vibrant community. And you just felt all the pain and suffering that must have gone on there at the time. But here in Australia, from my schooling, I've always got this message about if you don't learn from history, you're condemned to repeat it.
Yeah.
And as you're saying, that there's these events are still happening today in various parts
I
of the
would,
world.
I would agree with you, and I'd say this. For me, it's very personal.
Yeah.
My wife is Assyrian. My wife had to leave her country because she was persecuted as a Syrian Christian. Her family has recently arrived here because they were subject to genocide by ISIS. And the stories they tell are identical to the stories that our ancestors told, having experienced it 100 years ago. And this is 100 years later, and people are suffering the same thing. A couple of years ago, all the Armenians were forcibly removed from Nagorno-Karabakh, and suffered ethnic cleansing and brutality. And there are other wars going on around the world which could quite possibly fit the definition of genocide, pending an outcome of a result, and pending, obviously, the political will of certain powers which support the perpetrators of genocide, actually bringing them to justice.
But I suppose, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on perhaps what we as individuals, because sometimes it just
I do have a thought. First of all, we've got to treat everyone decently. One of the things I love about this country is there's a very large Turkish community. They disagree vehemently about all of this, and our role and their role and everything. They will never raise their voice. They'll always speak respectfully, and they'll respectfully disagree, okay? That is one of the success stories of Australia, that we live as communities side by side with a lot of bad blood and history between us, Cyprus, this, whatever, but we live with a lot of mutual respect and tolerance for each other. And that's something that both communities should be proud of. That's what you can do. You can also go and tell your politicians something like this. You know, you're talking about how it's very important to have a voice to Parliament and a truth-telling commission for our native peoples who suffered genocide and their land was taken away from them. So how come you support this one, but you don't want to recognise the other one? And then you might want to go to Frankston and say to people like we do, and we've done that recently, said to the MP in Frankston who's admitted this, state MP, you know what, 100 years ago, for people, Aussies in Frankston were raising money for Armenian refugees who are victims of genocide. You need to recognise this, you know, and you make it part of Australian history. There were all sorts of aid committees formed here at that time to look after Greek and Armenian orphans and refugees. It is part of Australian history. There's that great monument to George Tavine Treloar, which was set up by the Greek community spearheaded by PONTIAKI, ESTIA in Ballarat, because he witnessed the harrowing after effects of the genocide and helped these people rebuild their lives in Greece. And we've made that statue part of the local architecture and compelled Ballarat Council and the people of Ballarat to confront that history. You can do that. You just have to talk about it and care about it and not be like, where are they? Let's go back to flashback. These guys. That is not the solution. The solution is advocacy, yeah? And being good, decent people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. In addition to that picture there, how do you explain the fact that a lot of the supporters of a lot of parties in Greece don't make a sound about the genocide of the Christian people in Asia Minor, the Greeks, the Armenians, the Assyrians? Not a peep, no demonstrations, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Your comment?
I've often said that the Greek people are sometimes not a nation, but a disparate conglomeration of insular-looking tribes, and the only thing that they have in common is that they mutually agree that Kolokotronis, Megalexandros and Socrates were their ancestors. Okay, but apart from that, if it didn't happen in my village, I don't really care. And you see that also here. Most of the people who turn up to genocide commemoration functions are from the Pontian community, not many other supporters, because it's considered a Pontian thing, like we own as communities. The Pontians own the genocide, the Cretans own the Battle of Crete. Well, that kind of makes sense because it happened in Crete. But you know what I mean? The Kalamatans own the Battle of Kalamata. It belongs to us. And if we don't have it, we'll invent something just so that we're important. It's not that way. The Armenians are different. They don't talk about the Pontian genocide or the Thracian genocide or the Asia Minor genocide. We have 3 dates, separate dates, to commemorate the same thing, to make 3 different communities feel important. Yeah? They talk about the Armenian genocide. And that happened throughout the whole length and breadth of the Asia Minor and Syria. Armenian genocide. Assyrians are divided into 3 religions, 2 alphabets, and dialects that are not mutually intelligible. They call it the Assyrian genocide. Yeah? Because they consider if it happened to one of us, it happened to all of us. That's the difference. It's a difference of mentality. We still haven't evolved to have that common, if you like, andilipsi, in my opinion, sometimes. Or at least in the avenues of power where it counts. No. But if we're looking for votes from the Pontian community, we'll go up there to Thessaloniki and Kalamaria and, you know, weep and do what we have to do. Unless you like Boutari, but Theos Choreston.
Costa, I think you made an important point just a few seconds ago. Personally, the way I read our own community in relation to our ethnic identity, we do have an ethnic identity, but it's a regional ethnic identity. Culturally, in terms of traditions, in terms of our intellectual makeup, we're first of all, most of all, and above all, Cretans, as you said, then from Kalamata, then from Epiro, then from, let's say, Lefkada. I see the deputy mayor of Nuremberg now. It's a friendly remark. So, and what we don't have in Greece, because of television nowadays, because of the national education system, you might have a national identity. In here, because the community was formed in the 40s and 50s,
Before
with regional,
exactly,
with regional associations, regional identities, regional dialects, I've come to the conclusion personally, and I'd like to hear your opinion, that we do not have a Greek national ethnic identity. We have a regional Greek ethnic identity.
It's a complicated question. I think we're both right and wrong. A lot of the people who came here in the 40s and the 50s went to Greek school and they had a nationalistic conception of a Greek identity foisted upon them. And even though you might laugh at that and feel that that was quaint, that actually sustained us up until now in ways that it didn't in Greece. Okay. Where you get people here who retain aspects of their culture or knowledge of their history here because of that, the after effects of that, and that's gone in Greece because it's no longer relevant in Greece. But again, the question is, what is relevant in Greece? Should that be relevant here, and vice versa? We've been here for a very long time. How we see our identity and how that informs our lives as Australians, because that is what we are, whether we like it or not, is possibly different. And perhaps a lot of our own championing of these issues here has to do with our innate desire to use these subconsciously in order to further our own sense of our own identity. You know, we find meaning in the suffering and the genocide of all of these victims of genocide because, you know what, if we lose the identity for which they were killed, does that mean that their suffering was for nothing? That's very real and makes more sense here, possibly, than over there. But I mean, at the end of the day, στη Macedonia, there are a lot of people who identify as Pontian and feel the genocide keenly, you know, but Greece has got a lot of problems. We have possibly the economic and the cultural honesty, if you like, because I can't think of that word in English at the moment, to champion to the extent that we do these issues. Greece has got a whole lot of other things going on. It's a question of priorities, isn't it? But this is unacceptable. You can't excuse this, in my opinion.
Costa, I want to congratulate you. That was really outstanding, and you made something that is truly dire. You made it interesting and enjoyable and amusing in parts because, as we know from the ancient tragedians, tragedy and comedy converge, you know, in situations like this. There are many, many ways of discussing this, and we have the socio-political, and of course you did that brilliantly, and I like very much what Marcos had to say as well. But there's also philosophical, and I want to put my voice into the discussion.
And for those of you who don't know, Dina is a cultural historian, and she's got amazing insights into this in an academic level, so yeah, a bit of context.
Thank you, Costa. That's very generous. But, you know, I remembered Tsaloumas's beautiful essay on the distant present, the late Dimitris Tsaloumas, and he made a comment that has always resonated with me, that, see, we're talking about people who came here a little prior to Second World and certainly after the Second World War, and they were extremely close to their particular topos. It's a concept that we find difficult now or difficult to comprehend because we have a broader perception. But I perfectly understand why the Pontian people feel so incredibly connected to that geographical
space. That's a no-brainer. What we don't understand is
Yeah.
why none of us, in general, the broader community doesn't feel the same way.
But I'm from Evia and
Yeah,
I'm
you
here
feel it.
tonight.
You
Do you
feel
know
it, yeah.
what I mean? And I would, if we go around the room, I think you'll find there are a lot of
What about them?
Alcala, this is just, you know.
But that's the people that pull the strings.
Yeah.
They're the people that inform what goes on in the schools.
Yeah.
They're the people that put in the textbooks «Ήτανε
Yes.
συνοστισμός
Yes.
αυτό που έγινε στη Σμύρνη». That's an issue. That has after effects here because we have, I think, Dina, and you probably agree with me, although you might not, there's a cultural cringe where whatever we develop here in terms of culture is somehow illegitimate. We have to get it from Greece and we have to get their approval. There's almost that kind of thing.
Yeah, there are all sorts of
Yeah,
tangents.
so there's
I
all of
want
these
to-
things in play.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to ask you something because you come from a legal background as well as a philosophical and socio-cultural.
Allegedly, yeah.
You cover everything, Costa, in a way that very few people do. Why is it, I have my own thoughts
Yeah.
on this, I believe it is extremely important, but I would like you to articulate why is it so important that the Australian government recognises these genocides?
Okay.
Now, why is
I'll
that?
tell you why. Because it's a philosophical and moral position. And we've been brought up in this country and we have this sense that Australia stands for decency and justice. And most of the time Australia does. And when they get it wrong, it might take a long time, but they eventually come around to admit it. They did it with what happened with the native peoples of this country and the fact that the government wanted to create a voice and the thought process behind the voice, whether you agree with the mechanics or not, that's a separate issue. The fact that they wanted to provide some type of voice to victims and to empower them, yeah? That's important. That shows that decency. You know, that voice itself was met with a lot of scepticism within ethnic communities, including ours, yeah? For many reasons, which I won't go into. And my question, I had this discussion with state MPs, and I said to them, you want us to go out and talk about the voice, and we do. We go and do outreach to elderly members of the community who are suspicious, sceptical, or want to know why. And one of the questions we get back is, hang on, how sincere are these people, and how can you assure us that this is not happening for the purposes of political expediency, when we've been hammering away at these other issues which are historical and won't affect the Australia in any way, and they steadfastly deny to accept them. That's my answer.
Hi, I just wanted to say that that picture with the Parliament is not representative of the Greek people in Greece, and I can say that with certainty because I've lived most of my life in Athens. And
is Athens representative of the Greek people? Which part of Athens?
I live in Likavitos, if that means anything.
Is Likavitos representative of the Athenian people?
Anyway, it doesn't matter. So all I can say is this. I can tell you that 1 in 3 Greeks is a refugee, and that
probably.
all the people, when I wrote my first book on Cyprus, people from Constantinople, we still, by the way, Constantinople in Greece, we call Constantinople.
Well, most
Greek
of
and
us
English.
do. I've
Always.
seen in some
you
things
said-
where they call
you
Istanbul.
said something about that before, but anyway.
Well, Istanbul is a Greek word too, you know.
Yeah,
Istanbul
sure,
and
but
all
we
that.
don't use it.
No,
we don't use it. Not in Greece.
Just
Anyway.
like we don't call Victoria Nikia, which means Victoria, and we should.
Anyway, that's another issue. Anyway, I just wanted to say that because 1 in 3 Greeks is a refugee, yes, there is a kind of embrace and a unity between us. And I found that out only when I wrote my first book about Cyprus. These people from Denidos, Ivros, I didn't even know where these places were when these people reached out to me, you know. And all sorts of parts of Asia Minor, you know, they all would write a letter and say, congratulations, we want to meet you, and invite me to do a launch at the Nea Smyrni town hall or something, you know. I was very moved.
So not Likavitos.
No, I said...
So Nea Smyrni is the representative of the Athenian people.
No, I just said that a lot of people, 1 in 3,
Okay.
and I can talk also about Idra, where I have my holiday house, and they're the people who have
You just
migrated.
made a big mistake because you've just invited everyone into this room to your
I'm
holiday
sorry.
house this
Anyway,
summer.
all I can say is that
Andrea, before
before
you make any other faux pas and you invite us to your other holiday house in
You can
Mykonos,
come.
I know I will be there. I will say this, I agree with you 100%. We have a romantic attachment to our prosfigya, but when you say that this is not representative of the Greek people, these are the elective representatives of the Greek people. And there is nothing that we can do and say to excuse that. The Greek people per se themselves, yes, have a romantic view of the prosfigya, and there's all those Imagises, the Smyrnis and all the other shows, and you love it, Gegrafon Vivlia, and there are serials, and everyone feels romantic about it, but it doesn't affect their daily lives. Okay, and when the crunch comes and they need to show up, it's not many people that do, and that's a symptom of the fact that if it was something important, it was something that they thought that would enrage the Greek people if they didn't turn up. The reason why they did this is because they know that they could get away with it, because it was not important to Psyphophorus, because that's the nature of politics.
Sure, but I'm still saying that the Greek people do care.
We love the Greek people. We are part of them,
They do-
whether they
do
like it or
care.
not.
And even like, as I said, even in Idra, you know, the people
Ζήτω Λυκαβητός,
came
ζήτω η Μύκονος και η
from Asia
Ύδρα.
Minor
I
and
agree.
live there, they all like always get together on these occasions.
Yep.
And that's very moving. And they make everybody else interested in these occasions who are not refugees. And I
Brilliant.
find that
Well,
amazing.
that's an important point, and I'm glad that you made it. Party in Mykonos in August.
Okay. I think we have to. Yes.
One question. David Trelaw referred to the Pontics as displaced people.
No.
What's the difference, Dean, between displaced and a refugee?
Okay, there's this place and that place.
I like that one.
I couldn't help
Why?
it. I'm the father of 3 kids. I get to say a dad joke once in a while.
That's okay.
Daughter, when you're displaced, είσαι εκτοπισμένος. You are taken from your place somewhere else.
And pushed out.
Okay, now the means by which that happens is not necessarily through sfayes. Okay? You can be forcibly removed but not killed. Okay, but the International Convention for Genocides also includes forcibly removing people from their place with the intent to make sure they don't come back. So the legal definition of genocide in the international courts now has evolved beyond just killing people for the sake of annihilating them. That had to be defined because you had the Holocaust, which was just in a whole different league. And there were people saying, well, no. A proper genocide, in inverted commas, is when you just want to get rid of everyone. And the scholars and the jurists said, no, it could be you want to remove part of the people, or you might even want to remove the culture of the people. So that how they used to take the stolen generation away from their parents and try and bring them up as white people, that's a cultural genocide, according to the definition. So it's complex, and there's a lot of academic and legal discussion about how that works. So when he talks about displaced, he means they were taken away from their place, they were removed from their place. But when he was writing, the thing had just happened, and it hadn't finished yet, so there was not enough evidence to see exactly what happened. He was dealing with the after effects and trying to help these people resettle.
Thank you for the clarification.
Litz, I believe you have something to present, Dean.
A bag.
Okay, this is just a small token of appreciation,
Thanks,
Dean,
Litz, I appreciate
from
it.
PONTIAKI, ESTIA.
Thank you.
And it's not been only...
It's from Madame Lulu from Monastiraki. Όχι Λυκαβητός, Monastiraki.
25 years you've been with us.
And
we'd
I
like
hope
to
I'm there
thank
for
you.
25 years more. I don't know how your descendants will like this, but I plan on being a burden to them
Oh
as
my
much
God,
as you guys
okay.
as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And also a small gift from the Greek community as well. Thank you.
Andrea, surkome, Idra, here we come.
Να το πιεις στην υγεία μας,
Thank you,
Κωνσταντίνε.
thank you. Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone, and hope to see you all here next week as well. Thank you. Also help yourself to the food. Thank you, Kula, for the various delicacies you've prepared. Vulas.